Hello everyone. So a few days ago, I made a blog post about some of the gay relationships that we see in the Old Testament and the Tanakh. And I didn't tell that much about it. I didn't summarize the Epic of David or the Book of Samuel because I encouraged people to go out and read it for themselves. However, I will admit that the entire Epic of David is very, very long, and even the Book of Samuel, where most of the relationship between David and Jonathan exists, is also very long. So some people ask me if I would summarize it for them. And I still really, really encourage you to read the Epic of David for yourself. It's a wonderful epic narrative. As long as you read it as such, this is a story, it's an epic narrative like the Odyssey. It is not like a historical document. But if you read it as that, it's a very interesting story. But like I said, I wanted to point out a few more things. So I only did the one quote from Samuel 2 and David's lamentation for the death of Jonathan. But most of the relationship is actually in the first book of Samuel. And for reference, it's between chapters 18 and 21. This is the very romantic part, and like I said, if we read all of the Tanakh, this is the longest told love story. It goes on for, all the way until Samuel 2 when he passes, but the bulk of it is very romantic, it's very Shakespearean, it's almost like reading Romeo and Juliet. So to give some background about the first 16 chapters of the first book of Samuel, doesn't bring up David at all. He doesn't come in until chapter 16. Up until that point, it's all been about how Samuel came to be a prophet of God, how Samuel anointed Saul as the first king of the nation Israel, of how Saul disobeys God and God, takes back his ordination, and then how Samuel seeks out a new person. It's almost kind of like the story of King Arthur until he finds David. So, at this point, David has just killed Goliath, and David was promised the king's daughter's hand in marriage for having done so. So David goes back to King Saul, and the king asks him several questions about who he is, who his father was, and so on and so forth. And then right after he finishes talking to Saul, chapter 18, the very opening, when David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. Now Saul took him into his service. He's referring to David. So he takes David into his service that day and will not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan and David made a pact because Jonathan loved him as so. Jonathan took off the cloak and tunic he was wearing and gave them to David, together with his sword, bow, and belt. So right here, instead of taking the king's daughter's hand in marriage, instead it tells us that David and Jonathan become bound by their soul and make a pact together. So this is the first beginning of their love story. Now after that, Saul, he appoints David to be the head of his military. He tries to get him to marry his first daughter, and David doesn't. And eventually, as David becomes really popular amongst the kingdom, particularly amongst soldiers, Saul becomes jealous and nervous that David might rise to overthrow him. So Saul seeks out to murder David. Now, like I said, when you're reading this starts reading almost like a Shakespearean story, which is very interesting. So, anyways, Saul at this point is out to kill David. And in chapter 19 at the very beginning, Saul urges his son Jonathan to go and kill David, and Jonathan goes to talk to Saul because it says right here, so this is the first opening line of 19, but Saul's son Jonathan became very fond of David. And Jonathan told David, "My father Saul is bent on killing you." And he explains that tomorrow morning he is going to try and talk his father down because Saul likes Jonathan. He's his most favored son. And this continues. Fighting breaks out between Jonathan and Saul a little bit. David flees to try to not be killed. And eventually they meet back up. So this is now chapter 20. David is fleeing in the countryside, and Jonathan comes to find him, and this is where it starts getting very romantic and kind of Romeo and Juliet-ish, where this is actually kind of where they get married and they promise themselves to each other. So in chapter 20, David flees to Naioth, blah, 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 and Jonathan comes and said, what have I done? What is my crime? Oh, no, so David says to Jonathan, Jonathan comes to find David in Naioth, and David says, what have I done? What is my crime, my guilt against your father? Why does he seek to kill me? And Jonathan is saying, well, maybe he's not. So they start creating this plan to try and figure out what's going on. Jonathan says to David, whatever you want, I'll do it for you. So David says to Jonathan, tomorrow during the new moon, I'm to sit with your father. And he explains this elaborate plan of trying to work out a way so that Jonathan can know for sure what the king's plan is to kill David, and so that David can get away. But the interesting part is how it concludes. So as they're hashing out this plan, it essentially says, thus has Jonathan covenanted with David, and may the Lord requite the enemies of David. So once more they made a covenant together, just as God made a covenant with Israel in the ark. Jonathan makes a covenant with David. Jonathan, out of his love for David, adjured him again, for he loved him so. Jonathan said to him, tomorrow will be the new moon, and you will be missed when your seat remains vacant next to mine. So the day after tomorrow go down all the way to the place where you hid the other time, and stay close to the Azel zone. So I didn't read that part, but if you do go read this for yourself, and I encourage you, there's a part where Jonathan tells David to go hide in their secret place. He was essentially telling him to go hide in that place again. And he summarizes that he's going to shoot arrows and send a servant out to gather them, and if he tells him that the arrows are over here, it means that he's safe, and if he tells him the arrows are behind him, it means that the king is indeed planning to kill him and to flee. So David runs and flees, and then Jonathan sits at the dinner and essentially confronts his father, saying, I let David go back to his family, blah, 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 blah. And that's when Saul reveals himself. He rages himself against Jonathan. And this is, if you are a same-sex couple, this is very kind of coming out. In fact, I forget where the verse is, but Jonathan actually says to David that he would come out in the open with him at some point. But here in front of Saul says, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. So he's yelling at Jonathan, Saul. He shouts, I know that you're on the side of David, to your shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness. So if you are a same-sex couple, this kind of comes off as Saul knows that they are a same-sex couple, and he's just furious at them for this. This is where it becomes, like I said, a little bit more like Romeo and Juliet, where Saul's real vindictiveness against David seems to actually be the fact that he is in love with Jonathan and did not marry his daughter. So in the morning, Jonathan went out into the open for the meeting with David, and he does the whole 3 arrows thing. And Jonathan says to David, go in peace, for we have been sworn to each other in the name of the Lord. May the Lord be witness between you and me, and between your offspring and mine forever, that we shall be. David then went his way, and Jonathan returned to the town. So this is the most important thing, and this is at the very, very end of chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse 42, right before chapter 21. Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for we too have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord. May the Lord be witness between you and me, and between you and your offspring of mine, forever that we are. David then went, blah, 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 blah. But the point here is, it is very, very clear that Jonathan and David have sworn each other to each other. That first they make a pact, then they make a covenant to be together, and here it makes it very clear that they have sworn themselves to each other in the name of God, and that God witnessed this and have allowed them to be together forever. And that is where their story kind of ends for the time being, at which point David goes into big hiding, and there's this whole long chase where Saul is hunting him down. David gains followers amongst many of the Hebrew people. Eventually they confront each other, and David has the chance to kill Saul, and he doesn't. He shows him mercy, and that's when Saul turns around and says, what a great fool I have been, you truly are the better man. You have done nothing wrong but shown me kindness, and yet I hunt you down, yada, 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 and proclaims that Samuel will someday be, that David will someday be the true king of Israel, but please don't let the history books forget about Saul and his children. And then we, of course, get to the beginning of Samuel 2, when Jonathan dies, and I quoted that part. So this is the book of Samuel 2, chapter 2. This is David's song and lamentation to Jonathan passing. How have the mighty fallen in the lack of battle? Jonathan, slain on your heights. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were most dear to me. Your love was wonderful to me, more than the love of women. How have the mighty fallen? The weapons of war perished. So without a doubt, this is such a clear same-sex relationship. It is just blatant, and I don't know how anyone can read any of it without realizing that they were in a relationship. Like I said, let's go back to Samuel chapter 18. Jonathan's soul became bound with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. Jonathan and David made a pact because Jonathan loved him so. How can you take this in any other context? They say that their souls bound together and that they loved each other so much and that Jonathan loved him so much that he makes a pact. Now, it doesn't specify what the pact is, but it's clear that the word is intending to mean that they made a pact to be together. And it's encouraged further in the next language of the covenant. They make a covenant to be together. And then in the last little bit that I told you in chapter 20, 42, where Jonathan tells him, the two of us have been sworn to each other in the name of the Lord. May the Lord be witness between you and me, between our offsprings and mine, forever. He's saying that forever we are united. It's an amazing story. And I can't believe that anyone would read this and try to suggest that Jonathan and David were not together and were not lovers. It's so absurd. And just the fact that David himself says, your love was wonderful to me, more than the love of women. And note that even in the Hebrew, the word here, love, clearly implies the sexual love between two people. So when he says more than love of a woman, he's saying the sexual love of a woman. He is, without a doubt, saying that he had a sexual relationship with Jonathan. And you could read the entire story, or at least that section, essentially chapters 18 to around 27, to be this whole Romeo and Juliet storytelling of Saul finding out that they are together and essentially swearing to kill David because of it, and eventually coming to terms with it. So anyways, I'm going to end this here. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully that clarifies a few things. But please, please, please go and read this for yourself. Tell me what you think. I know plenty of devoted Christians who are going to debate and debate and debate, but the reality is, I know it's my interpretation, and that's why I want you to read it for yourself and come up with your own interpretation. It's very, very clear, though, that David and Jonathan loved each other in more than just in a quote-unquote brotherly way. They loved each other very intimately. They were lovers. They were committed to each other. They swore themselves to each other in the name of God. They essentially said that they married each other. But once more, the sacrament of marriage hadn't really been... it existed, but it existed more in the means of a contract because women were more like property. So a lot of times when they talk about marriage, they're literally talking about a contract to buy a woman. So when they're saying this kind of sworn to each other language, it's deeper than marriage. It's saying that they're devoted and committed to each other. Anyways, go read it. all the Christians who want to bash me away, go ahead and do so in the comments. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you, and Baruch Hashem.